But the danger, of course, is that all gets destroyed. Another thing that was a good reason for them to do the Kursk operation was to give their forces experience in combined arms offensive operations, which is something they did not have particularly, although they had done a good job the previous year with Kherson and the offensive then. But they didn't have a lot of. So again, go back to logistics. If you think about logistics, not just as being about supply, it's not just about supplying your forces, although that obviously is important. It's also about moving them around. And if you want to win a battle, you need to get all of the right people, all of the right equipment, fully fueled with plenty of ammunition, well rested, well trained, all in the same place at the same time, doing a range of different jobs. You need the infantry to be protecting the tanks. You need the tanks to be moving forward under air cover. So you need aircraft all coordinated and coordinate. When you're talking about large scale operations like that, the complexity of organizing it and getting all the right people in the right places with the right equipment at the same time is a very, very difficult puzzle to solve. So you need practice.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, the legendary Dr. Ken Fraser from Australia, specifically Canberra, and I'm so delighted to have you back, Dr. Ken Fraser, to really give us an update what's really going on geopolitically, specifically Ukraine-Russia war, but also the implication that it has, such as Syria, Israel, and really the world as a whole. So welcome back, Dr. Ken Fraser, to the show. It's always a special treat, and so I was waiting for this for a long time to have you back.
We've had a lot of toing and froing getting it organized, but it's a great pleasure to be able to participate again. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's just start. Give us some context of what's going on.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say that I have no special knowledge about. I don't have access to any classified information or anything like that. So I'm only going on what you or I or anybody can see in the news or in various. I mean, I do read a lot of what's in various outlets and stuff, but I don't have any particular classified knowledge. So I can talk about the implications of what seems to be happening. But if you ask me exactly how many tanks Russia has or something like that, I don't take any numbers that I mention seriously. So just a caveat.
First and foremost, what always comes up is how come that Ukraine can hold the line so long against such a big power, nuclear power such as Russia. How come? How is it logistically possible?
Well, logistically, that's a big question, of course. They do have a certain advantage because they have what are known as internal lines of communication. In other words, they're in a circle, if you like, around. It's not a circle, of course, but you know what I mean. There's a border, and they've got their main supply sources are within that border, and so they've got like a hub and spokes kind of supply system that way. It's much easier to supply forces when you're in a kind of your supply sources in the middle of your lines, at the center of your lines. It's not the center, but it's inside, internal to the occupied area. Whereas the Russians on the other side, they have to cover a whole front. But to get something from this part of the line to this part of the line, they have to go all the way around, which is known as external lines of communication and supply. So they have much more stuff, and they have many more people, but they have this difficulty because of the length of the line. So if you're talking about logistics exactly, then that's one advantage that the Ukrainians have had. Another advantage is that the Ukrainians are fighting for their own homes in many cases, and it's been known since the dawn of time, since the earliest writings we have on the art of war, that troops will fight much more strongly for their own house, their own families and their own home cities and home towns. They're much more likely to fight to the death in those circumstances, whereas on the Russian side or on the invaders' side, and generally, they don't have as much motivation. I mean, their motivation is not to get shot by or court-martialed for cowardice or sent back to jail. They have pay, of course, and they have other motivations. They might be patriots, they might have ideological motivations, but they don't have that do or die kind of motivation that's to do with the people who are protecting their homes and families do. Not only homes and families, but their national identity is one thing that they certainly are also motivated by, and which is specifically the aim of the Russians, is to remove the Ukrainian national identity, although that might be putting it a little bit strongly. They don't necessarily want to destroy Ukraine, but they do want it to be part of Russia. They consider it already to be part of Russia. Vladimir Putin does. Whether the soldiers on the front line think that, that's a different story again. Another reason, of course, why they've been able to hold off the attack by Russia is another very old principle that it's much easier to defend than to attack. Usually you need, just as a general rule, you need 3 to 6 times as much people and equipment and ammunition to attack than you do to defend. So defense is always easier. And so that's a big advantage for the Ukrainians, especially if you can consolidate a line. So if you can stay in the same place for long enough to dig proper trenches and put in proper fortifications, minefields, all that kind of thing, which I think the Ukrainians have been doing, although they did go on the offensive in Kursk, but that's perhaps something we can talk about later. I think those are the three. And of course, lastly, there's the massive amounts of aid in the form of weaponry, drones, ammunition, equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, all that kind of thing, that we know that they've been receiving from their allies in the West and in other places. And they've also now done a remarkable job of starting up their own domestic defense industrial base. So they're able to make their own drones, and indeed, by some reports, they're actually manufacturing ballistic missiles, which is an astonishing achievement given that they're in the middle of fighting a war. So I think those are the main factors of why they were able to. Also, the other thing, final sort of icing on the cake, was the incredibly botched nature of the initial invasion in 2002. It was quite astonishing, really, to see how incompetent the Russians were when they tried to initially take Kyiv and move like that. Unless it was all a big feint and all they really wanted was the Donbass in the end, but that seems a little unlikely. It looked to me like they were genuinely trying to invade and take over Kyiv and take over Kharkiv and the whole country, really. And they were moving on Odessa, the ports, and so that. But they botched it in a range of ways that are quite astonishing, really. So that initial setback was enough to give the Ukrainians time to organize, try to close the borders and not let any men out, started for trying to find weapons from wherever they could, that kind of thing. So that was uh, another reason that they were able to fend off that initial invasion, and that allowed them to consolidate their systems and their positions for the rest of that time. So that was a rather long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, this is really impressive. And you just said, I mean, I have never heard this actually, and it really makes sense that you need probably 6 times the man to fight an enemy and defeat an enemy if you actually invade a country. And so it really makes sense. And also, obviously, the Ukrainian soldier, they know the place, right? So they, but to another, and you mentioned it, to Kursk, what
Yes,
they did.
that's right.
And
That's
one
the advantage.
reason, apparently, it was to make sure that Russian troops, they will move somewhere else and they will go back to Kursk. But how is it that the Ukrainian forces can stay so long on Russian territory, for example, in Kursk, because there, this argument doesn't really apply. To me, it's just amazing. I have no clue. And on TV, those kind of things are not explained. And so I think for myself, who has no idea how you wage war, and you are a specialist, I was so fortunate to be in your course at the Australian National University, and you were actually teaching, IR class, and just brilliant. And just so tell us how come that they are able to stay in course still, because I think sometimes, like, well, they could just shoot, bombard or whatever. And I guess people who Russians who are living in the Kursk region, well, either they are held hostage, I don't know, that's just an assumption, or how come that this takes so long, for example.
For the Russians to push them back out again. You mean that they've
Yeah.
been able to stay in Kursk so long? Um, Again, I haven't been on the ground. I don't know anything about that. And I should add that I've never seen a battle or participated in a war either. So you can call me an expert if you like. But and I have read and taught a lot about this sort of subject. But on the ground tactics, something else again. Experience in actual battles gives people a very different perspective on things. So just with that caveat, just I don't want to claim more than I've got to give you. There are a number of reasons why the Kursk salient might have lasted so long. Again, this is me just making estimates. So I don't have any special knowledge. Um, One thing was that the Russians were, in fact, and still are, to my knowledge, making incremental gains all along the Donbass front, all along the southeastern line. Now, they're not big, spectacular encirclements or massive gains that they're making overnight, but it's a step-by-step process of them moving forward. And because of what some people would call the Russian way of war, um, which is very, I was going to say manpower, but should say personnel intensive, um, is that they use a lot of, they're very costly in casualties the way they fight. So they need a lot of men. You said 6 to 1. Um, so you need a 6 to 1 advantage to attack. Sometimes it's a 6 to 1 advantage in terms of men, like personnel, or it can be a 6 to 1 advantage in terms to do with supplies, ammunition, weaponry, tanks, that sort of thing. And it depends on, it's not a hard and fast. Usually people talk about at least 3 and up to 6 to 1 advantage to do that. And even then, it's a difficult job. The Germans tried to break through Verdun for years during the First World War. And the French defended for a long time, and they took a lot of casualties. It's very heavy work. And the Germans, the attackers, also take a lot of casualties. So the Russians needed a lot of people in the Donbass, in the eastern front. Uh, and so when the Ukrainians invaded Russia to the north, and it looked to me initially like they were trying to cut off a salient there was a bit of a bend in the line there where the Russians might have been exposed and they might have been encircled, and that could have been what the Ukrainians were trying to do. There was also the region, the town of Sumy sort of to the south that they might have been aiming to encircle as well, but they didn't get that far. The other thing they might have been trying to do is simply to take some territory from Russia, take and hold some territory in Mother Russia, in order to use it as a bargaining chip at the peace table, at the peace conference. A lot of what happens in wars and a lot of what operational strategy and grand strategy is about is organizing yourself a good place at the peace conference. So the war is not really about the war, which seems like an odd thing to say. What it's really about is the deal we make up at the end of the war. And what the Russians want to do is make a deal at the end of the war that involves them having all of Ukraine. But they might be negotiable on that, given that it's costing them so much. It's costing Russia huge amount of stockpiles, of money, of people, obviously, and much blood. So the Ukrainians might have been hoping that the Russians would come to the table, or when the peace conference arises eventually, that they'd be able to say, okay, we'll give you back with what we've got in first, but you give us Zaporizhia or Donbass, or sorry, not Donbass, Donetsk, or something like that. That would be a doubtful kind of proposition, but that they might have been trying to do that. They're in a difficult position now. So one reason why it might have taken so long is that the Russians were not that concerned about it from the beginning. There was a lot of hoo-ha about it when the Kursk invasion happened. Excuse me. No, this was going to end the war, and I was excited. I thought, oh, great, they've gone over to the offensive, which is they sort of have to do at some point, the Ukrainians. But then it kind of seemed to stall. Again, attacking into country that is not yours is a much harder job than defending country that is yours. And you made a good point about local knowledge of the countryside as well. That makes a big difference as well. You're right about that. So it may be that one reason they'd been able to stay there for so long is that the Russians were just not that concerned about it, and that they were more interested in continuing to make their incremental gains in the Donbass around down near the Black Sea and that to the east. So they were able to contain the Kursk incursion, and now they've very patiently gone about making a deal with the North Koreans and bringing over North Korean equipment and blood to assist them there. So, but because they left it for so long, that's given the Ukrainians time to dig in to a certain extent. And so they've got trench systems and minefields and tanks. They've got a lot of good equipment there, as I understand it. Again, I don't have specialized knowledge about that. But the danger, of course, is that all gets destroyed. Another thing that was a good reason for them to do the Kursk operation was to give their forces experience in combined arms offensive operations, which is something they did not have particularly, although they had done a good job the previous year with Kherson and the offensive then. But they didn't have a lot of. So again, go back to logistics. If you think about logistics, not just as being about supply, it's not just about supplying your forces, although that obviously is important. It's also about moving them around. And if you want to win a battle, you need to get all of the right people, all of the right equipment, fully fueled with plenty of ammunition, well rested, well trained, all in the same place at the same time, doing a range of different jobs. You need the infantry to be protecting the tanks. You need the tanks to be moving forward under air cover. So you need aircraft all coordinated. And when you're talking about large-scale operations like that, the complexity of organizing it and getting all the right people in the right places with the right equipment at the same time is a very, very difficult puzzle to solve. So you need practice. The other thing you need practice at is actually being in a battle. I said before that I have never been in this circumstance, but I do know, I've read enough to know that the difference between a veteran and a recruit, where you can train somebody up to a certain point. You can do a lot of rigorous training and you can give them skills and you can do all kinds of uh, very highly, exercises and that sort of thing. And you can pretend to shoot at them, but everything changes when people are actually being shot at and they're seeing their comrades be injured or killed in them, and nevertheless having to go forward and prosecute a plan. That kind of thing is invaluable. So a veteran, two people with the same training, and one of them has actually been in a battle, particularly in a successful battle, uh, and the other one hasn't, then the veteran is going to be the ones that survive, obviously, and the ones that are, that learn something from it and don't have such terrible psychological injuries that they're not able to do it again. So the ones that's a pruning thing, they call it blooding. You send your troops in to have a battle, you blood them, and it means some of them are killed, some of them are permanent casualties, some of them are not particularly effective, but the ones that are, the ones that get some experience and survive that battle, will be much better soldiers the next time they're into it. They understand what it's like to have someone genuinely trying to kill you. That's a very big thing. So they were benefited from the incursion into Kursk in that way as well. Although they did have experience defending, but doing combined arms offensive operations is a very, very difficult thing to do. But the risk, of course, the danger is that they get overextended there and that the Russians and the North Koreans who are there are able to either encircle and capture them or to completely destroy them, in which case all of that benefit disappears. If you don't have their people, their experience is useless to you if they just immediately are killed in the following day. So it's difficult to it's a difficult position for the Ukrainian command to be in, because they have to decide: do we want to hold on to this piece of Kursk in Russia, or do we think that we've had enough training now and enough experience that we withdraw, which loses us a bargaining chip, but it keeps us our forces who are now much more experienced. But it also looks as if we're retreating. The difference between withdrawing and retreating is very important. But it's also hard to discern for people who are not strategists themselves.
So what's the difference
So I hope all that
between
makes sense.
withdrawal and retreating?
Well, withdrawing is something you do to strengthen your position. Retreating is something you do because you have to. So if you've got, for example, if you have a line, a front line, and it's got a big bubble in it, then that's a dangerous position for you to be in, because it means you can be encircled. The enemy can come around and encircle you, or they also have a long line to attack you from. That is, so you don't want to have an isolated force too far in front of the front. So you might pull them back. So there are two things you can do. You can either push forward on either side to support them, or you can decide to pull them back to shorten the line. Um, to means you've got more soldiers per mile of line, and it means there's not as long a line for the enemy to attack, or maybe so that would be a strategic withdrawal, or would be an operational withdrawal. That wouldn't be because you'd been forced to exactly. It's a fine line, I guess, depending on the situation. But on the other hand, if you find yourself, as the Assad regime forces have found themselves on a few times, almost surrounded in a city where you're in a position where you know that you can't possibly defend where you are, then and you're being attacked, then you might retreat, and which is more like, I don't want to go back there. I'm not strengthening my position, but I'm being forced to because of the position I'm in. So that's the thing. It's a bit of a fine line at times, of course.
So it's a lot, and you
And
talked
then
about this
there's
too. It's a lot about morale as well, right? So it's huge. But to me, really, a
absolutely,
simple
yeah.
question: is it all worthwhile? Just the lives that are sacrificed. I mean, we're talking here about like 700, 6, 7, 5 to 700,000 Russians, and right now they say, well, Ukraine like 40,000. But I think that's not really accurate. You know, when I was
So I
traveling in
wouldn't
Europe,
think
I was
anybody
doing
would
the
live.
El Camino, and I was seeing so many Ukrainian mothers with their children, you know, alone, and their husband is fighting, and just to see and
Mm.
ultimately realize a whole generation and beyond that is basically growing up without a father. It's just, to me, it's just insane. So what do you think about the whole situation right now and the support of the West in supplying further weapons? Doesn't it just further give oil, or we spread further oil in the fire, and it just makes everything worse?
Well, this is the criticism that has been levelled at the Joe Biden in particular, but he certainly wasn't the only one. The whole of the Western alliance system basically kicked into gear and started supplying the Ukrainians with weaponry to resist the Russians. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's not only about protecting the state system. Um, so, just to step back a bit, the states, uh, like other states, they like to protect other states because they want to be protected themselves. So we have this world system that is composed of states, and it's while you'll hear um, state actors, so prime ministers, foreign ministers, the people who make these decisions, presidents, you'll hear them talking about, we're on the side of right and we want freedom and justice for all. All sides talk like that. Some of them are more believable than others. I wouldn't say they're all the same. They're definitely not all the same. And some of them, if you have to ask yourself, who would you like to be running the world? Would you prefer it to be Vladimir Putin, Russia under Vladimir Putin, or the US under their democratic system? We'll see what happens to that in the next few years. Um, if you so they're not all the same. You'll hear them talking about the humanitarian side of things, but it's not really why they go to war. The big wars that everybody agrees on are about states. So the Kuwait War in 1992, for example, sorry, yes, that's right, 1992. The end of 91 was about. It wasn't a There was a lot of rhetoric about Saddam Hussein being a horrible dictator and a murderer and a mass murderer and all of that, all of which was true. But that actually wasn't the reason they were doing it. The reason they were doing it was that he'd moved against another state. So they're not protecting the people. They don't particularly care about the people. They care about the organizational principle of sovereign states. So that's another reason why a lot of places were supporting Ukraine, because there's this fundamental principle of world order that you don't change borders by force, which is kind of ironic since most borders are created by force in the first place. But it is a very strong principle, and you will find states banding together, most commonly, less commonly, to try and stop genocides or to stop people being massively murdered and maimed, but much more strongly and more commonly to protect states. So that's, I think, what they're doing there. Um, so the argument is that I think you're alluding to is, since we in the West gave the Ukrainians all this weaponry and training and everything that we've given them incrementally, has that just prolonged the fighting and prolonged the suffering, even though the outcome will probably be the same? And eventually there'll be negotiated settlement where probably Ukraine loses some territory. They won't lose their entire existence, Not this round anyway. Maybe there'll be peace for 5 or 10 years, and then they'll have another go. That would be a most likely thing. Um, so is it
But just
worth it?
quickly,
The casualties.
just quickly, there's always this argument, and Jeffrey Sachs and Marsheimer actually say the same thing: is that, well, the Russian, they are not interested in expanding the territory. They basically say, if Ukraine will say, you know what, we will guarantee that we will not join NATO, this war will be done within hours. And so Donbass basically is just, and to some extent, according to some Russians, they say, well, this has just to be a buffer zone, the same reason why they took back the cream, right? That's basically their argument. And they are always saying that it's just insane what we're actually doing, because it's clear that, and when you think back the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? It's very similar. I mean, it was very, very close to just a horrific outcome. But ultimately the Russians were, you know, reasonable and took it down, and we were able to ultimately, end the Cold War. So, what's your take on that? Because that's an argument that's usually not really discussed. And then also others, such, for example, the German Chancellor, he said, for example, that if you don't support Ukraine, or if Ukraine will lose the war, then we will be next. And to me, to some extent, that is just not really realistic. So I can never imagine, for example, that Russia wants to take further and further territory, because let's face it, we see it right now. Russia is the biggest country in the world, and just to defend such a huge territory is a huge challenge. I mean, look at what happened with these Chinese balloons, I think in 2023, right? So America the same. It's really hard to actually protect your border, and to me, to some extent, when I look at that, and of course I'm not a specialist at all, but to me, it just it's common sense in so many ways that certain things, they just won't happen, but we are constantly told that they will. And therefore, I think Jeffrey Sachs, I think he's at Columbia University, he dedicated his whole life for the UN. Marsheimer, like, he's at the University of Chicago. And these people, they are completely ignored by mainstream media. They're basically considered somehow, Russian, favoring Russia, whatever. No, these people just, I think, they just see like the danger. And I think when I think about just generally like the world order, I think there are four major powers, like India, of course, Russia, China, and the US. And the rest is really somehow has to find ways of dealing with one another and find sensible compromises, otherwise. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's not necessary. I think to some extent, having a world where there are certain poles, I think also keeps, in many ways, things in order. And I think you made a very good talk actually a few years ago, where you were talking about weapons of mass destruction, which is crazy. It's just so dangerous, right? But you, even then, you actually said that on one hand, it's like a paradox, but it also keeps, in many ways, the peace, right? Because major powers, major nuclear powers
Well,
will
that's
never
the
fight
argument.
each
Yeah.
other.
Well, I mean, the nuclear deterrent thing is something that's really been revealed. Uh, the limitations of it have been revealed in with this in Ukraine, because um, it's it hasn't deterred Russia, but it has deterred the West from supporting Ukraine, the nuclear problem. But, but it's all bluff, you see. Or it sort of it has become apparent that Vladimir Putin was bluffing. Might be too strong a word, but I suppose, but he wasn't. He's not going to use nuclear weapons now. All you have to do is think about what would happen to his beloved Russia if he was to use a nuclear weapon. Now, it doesn't mean that Russia would be destroyed if it, if uh, Putin used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine that's not a member of NATO, there's not actually any obligation or reason for the Western alliance, or certainly not the US, to retaliate against that. So there's no reason. You would have to bet on it, right? You would have to say, because so in the hypothetical situation where Russia drops a nuclear weapon on Kharkiv, let's say, um, so then the Western nuclear powers have to think to themselves, so do we retaliate to that? Are we willing to drop a bomb on Leningrad or Volgograd or somewhere, or Moscow itself even, or Vladivostok? Pick somewhere big but not central, perhaps. Are we willing to cause that kind of destruction just in order to retaliate against a damage that's already been done in Ukraine? Or do we find some other way to, I don't know, reconcile it somehow? At the moment, there's a very strong taboo about nuclear weapons, but there's no particular, there's a no first use, very strong no first use thing there. But let's say Putin does it. I mean, there's a very strong taboo against invading another country in an unprovoked fashion too. So he's got no problem about breaking taboos like that.
But is
but
it
let's
is it
think about
unprovoked?
what would happen.
Just about this, is it? Do you at least
Well, that's
understand
a whole
where
other debate.
Russia is coming from? Because there's a huge
Yeah.
difference between understanding someone's positions and someone's intention why they did something and agreeing with it. I think everyone, strongly disagrees to invade a country, need to be condemned 100%. But can we understand from a Russian standpoint, given the fact that it is the biggest country, that is this one, I think it still has the most nuclear bombs, you know, and also it's to some extent its aspiration that it always has and always will have, that it is part of the big 4 5 in the world.
Well, there's an argument to say that it's a bit like China, like it's one of these civilizational centers. It's not a state like other states. It's it's something different. Like, the US, you could say something similar to that. It's not just a normal state. It's a not even just a great power. In fact, the US is what they would call a superpower. The Russians, they have a big landmass and a relatively large population, but economically they're not all that fabulous. And we've seen that even militarily they've been unable to uh, invade and take over this neighboring state that's not even it's they've improved, as we've talked about. They've adapted quickly and got a lot of supplies from outside, but that's all happened quite slowly. So the idea that the mighty Russian army could not, armed forces, including the air forces and the naval power, they've lost the battle in the Black Sea, which is, a very strongly counterintuitive thing. I think most analysts before the war would have said, well, there's no chance of that happening. And I think most analysts, I'm guessing, but most of them would say before the invasion, this special military operation, I certainly would have said, well, if the Russians want to have a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they'll be in Kyiv in a week. Not a week, maybe 6 weeks. It took the Americans, I think it was about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months to get to Baghdad in 2003. So it doesn't. People get very impatient when you start wars. They want everything to be over in 2 days. Well, it doesn't take 2 days. It takes a few weeks. But here we are in year 3, just about that, and they're still haven't been able to do that. That's quite a shock, and that shows that, leaving aside the nuclear weapons, the Russians are not a great power in terms of their military capabilities. So all this talk about, as you say, about invading Russia, Germany, the Germans or the Poles saying, we have to protect Ukraine because we'll be next. As John Bolton said the other day, has said several times, uh, with what army are they going to invade Poland or Germany? How are they going to get there? They might do missile strikes. They might even, the most extreme, use nuclear weapons on them. But what benefit would they get from that? Why would they want to do that? The question about it being unprovoked, the invasion of Ukraine being unprovoked, this is a hot topic, as I'm sure you're aware. A lot of people argue about it, including John Mearsheimer, who's been doing his very best to get out there and sell his point of view. He's all over. He's very easy if you're interested in hearing what John Mearsheimer has to say. Put his name into YouTube and you'll find plenty. And I recommend doing so. He's got a lot of very sensible, straightforward things to say. That there's this tendency to think that things are more complex than they are, whereas what you see in Russia is a couple of things. You see the NATO expansion, which, and you have to understand that Vladimir Putin doesn't think he's head of a normal state. He thinks he's the head of a civilization, of the Russian civilization, the same way that Xi Jinping thinks of China as not just the PRC, but the Chinese sphere of influence, a huge civilizational center of the world, as many Europeans would think the same way about Europe. So that's what Vladimir Putin thinks, and he also, I can't say what Vladimir Putin thinks, but this is the way people think. Mearsheimer also is saying that great powers like that, those civilizational powers, have different rules for what they can do, including organizing buffer states and spheres of influence, which is old-fashioned 19th century politics. No, that's not true. You could very easily say that the Soviet buffer states in all of Eastern Europe, for example, West Germany, Poland, all of those, the Estonian countries, which are all, the Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union. Anyway, don't take my word for it. But they did have a big buffer around there. So at that point, you could say the Soviet Union was a great power. It wasn't just a state; it was a huge system of states, including buffer states and junior allies in the West. So I think that's what the Russians are trying to do with Ukraine. They're trying to make a buffer between themselves and NATO, but because now they don't have one. The Baltic states, Finland now as well, Poland, not Belarusia, but they're sort of part of the Russian sphere of influence now. So it's not just about, so that's one thing, saying the expansion of NATO might be a reason for Russia thinking of themselves as a great power, following great power rules, is justified in establishing a buffer zone in Ukraine. But if you listen to the way Vladimir Putin talks, he does talk like that. He does talk about those sorts of questions. But he also says repeatedly and strongly, Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is not a state. Ukraine's a region of Russia. And he harks back to not ancient history, but medieval history with the establishment of what were known as the Kievan Rus. They were actually Vikings. They were Norsemen who came down the rivers from Finland and from the ice country up there and established trading posts along the river, including Kiev. And they became known as the Kievan Rus. And then after several centuries, the capital moved to Moscow. And so it's very old, so that was 1,000 years ago. And Putin's using that precedent from 1,000 years ago to say, actually, Ukraine, Kiev, and Russia, the Rus, are the same. there's no difference. So what he's doing in Ukraine is not invading another state; it's trying to take back a rebellious province of Russia. So there are those two arguments. There's the great power NATO expansion argument, and there's the Ukraine is actually a part of Russia, and we're trying to take it back argument. Neither of them really holds up because for one thing, they're based on ancient history. It's seeming rather ridiculous to hark back to the 10th century to justify what's happening now. But they're certainly not the only ones who do that. There are plenty of other people who talk about ancient history to make territorial claims all over the place.
But
Have I answered your question?
isn't it really absolutely no? I really appreciate that, and because you're just you make a very very strong case. But isn't it because sometimes we always think like, well, we in the Western world, we don't have any propaganda at all. But I think we have as much propaganda when you look at our media as, for example, Russia has, right? So it's in so
Yeah,
many ways,
yeah.
in really in one way. And you made a very strong point about what you were saying, that Russia simply will not have the manpower to go further and invade, Germany or whatever. I mean, of course, they feel like strongly provoked now, and that they somehow, say like, well, we can actually also fire some, you know, um, ballistic and missiles or whatever. I mean, this is obviously a big talk, and I think won't happen. But that really, this argument of the German chancellor is, I think it's just not really realistic. And so, what do you think?
No, well,
Why is it?
propaganda,
Why
we
is
can,
it that?
you go,
Okay, so, but do you really think like? I mean, these arguments are really out there. Do you think it is plausible that if Ukraine says, okay, we won't join NATO once and for all, do you think that is a good argument that the war will stop? Of course, there will be negotiations. There will be, where we draw the border and so on and so forth. Do you think this is really realistic? And if so, why does Ukraine not really consider this seriously? What do you think is the main obstacle?
I think they are considering it seriously. That, that what they want to say is what the Ukrainians want is a guarantee for the future that the Russians won't try again, that they won't invade again, so that they could make a deal now and say, okay, you take the Donbass and the Zaporizhia and Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, um, and in return for peace. And in return, we'll give you back the regions of Kursk that we've got, and uh, we'll guarantee not to join NATO. But if that was the end of the story, then that would be that would be an absolute victory for the Russians. They would sit back, they would then have time to be able to reconstitute their armed forces, to build more arms and ammunition and produce more ammunition, build up their stockpiles again, and in 5 or 10 years do it again. There's nothing particular to
But
stop them.
why will they
So
do it? If Ukraine says, okay, we won't join
for the
NATO,
same reasons that we're
Russia
doing it
has
now.
no reason ultimately to invade Ukraine, because according to Marsheimer and Sachs, it's really the main reason is simply that there is a buffer zone because of NATO.
No, because that's only one part of the reason. The NATO thing's only one part of the reason. The other part of the reason is that Ukraine is part of Russia, according to Vladimir Putin. So he will never stop. And other people who think like him, they will never stop trying to take Ukraine back and bring it under Russian political control. That'll never stop. And so what the um, Ukrainians want they want to be able to say what they really want is to say the Russians all get out of our country and give it back to us. But they might accept a deal such as I just described, where the Russians get several big chunks of land in return for an peace or at least a ceasefire, and the Ukrainians uh, undertake not to join NATO. But the Ukrainians won't do that without some kind of security guarantees. That's what they want from the world in
Absolutely.
general to say
But
that.
just one question,
And so, what's the
You know,
difference?
I,
What's the
I
difference
see what
between
you're
joining
saying.
NATO?
Now, the other argument is of Russia making this point, this invasion, is according to Jeffrey Sachs again and Marsheimer, is that because these attempted and coups, they say that constantly Ukraine was basically influenced by the West, and they argue that I think the revolution that happened in 2012, I think it was sponsored. I mean,
But it's
Jeffrey Sachs is very very clear. It was sponsored by the West. It was, and that's the reason. So do you think like it's more, do the way Russia actually wants Ukraine back, do you think it's really mostly provoked by the West because they want to somehow take control over the Ukraine in order to gain some grounds? And if so, what kind of grounds are they looking for? Why is it so important for the West to keep control over Ukraine?
Well, it's important because they have a lot of oil, they have a lot of grain, they have a lot of land. It's a very big place. They've strategically, it's just a lovely position to have on your side. The Crimea, I mean, all of that strategically is gold. You say the thing about the Western countries sponsoring or like creating the coup. There have been various the color revolution and then the Maidan protests and the coup. um, so there's a difference between the West sponsoring something, in other words, calling it into being something that didn't already exist. So you can do that. That's quite an old-fashioned thing to do. Is what you do is you go with a few suitcases full of cash and give them to the best organized, most extreme opposition group you can find, and you can and help them with organisation and some other things, and you can plunge a country into chaos without too much difficulty. Um, but the different words you see is if you say the West sponsored this rebellion and revolution and the coup on the one hand, or they supported a thing that was already happening in country. So that's a difficult thing to kind of disentangle. Just because the Americans or the Germans or whoever it was giving money to those people and support and tents to put up in Maidan Square and buses to get people and et cetera, that doesn't mean that the people who were doing it were not sincere or that they weren't, or that doesn't mean that the people of Ukraine don't support that thing. Ultimately, whether the Ukrainians want to be part of NATO or whether they'd rather lean towards Russia is a matter for the Ukrainian people. The difficulty at the moment is that nobody really exactly knows what the Ukrainian people want, partly because they're scattered all over Europe now. But even then, it's hard to make decisions um, because it's difficult to do surveys and things. But when there have been elections, I think there's a fairly clear leaning towards moving west because in terms of joining, they would like most of the people, I'm saying, would like to join the European Union. They'd certainly like to join NATO to protect them from Russia. And even the people who were vaguely favorable towards Russia before this invasion, there's a very good way to make people not like you very much, and that's to invade their countries and start killing their people and blowing up their homes and making their grandmothers freeze to death. people don't like that very much. And however sympathetic towards the Russians they might have been before that, they're not sympathetic towards them now, and so that's not going to happen. So the question is, if the Ukrainians say, "Okay, we won't join NATO, but we want, and we'll give you this land, and you'll stop bombing our energy infrastructure," they have to also say, "But we want to guarantee that you're not going to do this again in a few years." So where does that guarantee come from? The Russians can give it, but nobody will believe them. Um, so who is it going to be? NATO, or what's the difference between that and joining NATO? Is the United Nations going to guarantee such a thing? Well, they could, but nobody really believes that the United Nations has the teeth to enforce such a thing. So as to the continued fighting, you know, it's really, again, it's up to the Ukrainians whether they want to keep fighting to protect their homes, or whatever it is they think they're protecting, um, their nation, their existence as a separate state, all those sorts of things. So that's their decision to make, not mine or Chancellor Schulz's. Um, and what the other people have a decision to make as to whether they want to support what's already there, or how they're going to react to that. It could be that Donald Trump comes in and decides, which might, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump's, but he has a very transactional way of doing business, which is of doing politics, which is problematic in a lot of ways. But actually, when it comes to realpolitik on the world stage, transactional ways of doing business are not the worst ways of doing it. So he might say, okay, we're going to stop supplying Ukraine, which would, depending on what the European countries do, if the Americans stop giving the Ukrainian stuff, then the Russians will win there. But of course, then they'll have a guerrilla war. They'll have an insurgency to suppress for the next generation or two. It won't stop. Plenty of people in Ukraine will never stop fighting against Russian occupation. Plenty will, and they'll just go along with the new reality. But there'll be plenty who would, where has it happened before? Iraq, Vietnam, on and on. The Afghanistan, against several different enemies. The Soviets were in there for 10 years. There is a significant proportion of the population of Ukraine who will never stop fighting for independence, and the Russians will either have to kill them or deport their children and re-educate them into Russian, or do other things like that. So what has to happen in the end is some kind of balance where they're saying, okay, neither side's going to attack the other side, not because they suddenly like them, but because they understand that they can't, that they won't win, and that they'll suffer more. And for that ceasefire type situation to be stabilized for long enough that people begin to forget about the war, but that takes a long time. That takes a generation, 25 or 50 years. And even then, look at Cyprus. Look at Korea. They're still North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war, 70 years after the end of the hostilities. So that's certainly a possibility for Ukraine.
Fascinating, Dr. Ken Fraser. Now, just let's go a little bit what's going on in the region and the implication it has potentially on Ukraine-Russia war. Syria, they just toppled Assad, which was really a surprise. So how does this influence the trajectory of the war in Ukraine?
Um, it's and in another program we might talk about how it influences the situation around Israel and what they're doing, and with and Iran, because it has major implications for the chessboard, if you like, over there. Excuse me. Um, but as to the Ukraine thing, this is a real blow for the Russians. If recent reports in the last couple of days seem to suggest that they're withdrawing from Syria, from Latakia and Tartus, and the other base that I can't pronounce the name of. So if they're withdrawing and they appear to be packing up their gear and loading it up onto ships and they're withdrawing, so that's very bad for them because it's very bad for them there because, that was a major, they were supporting the Iranians from there, they were supporting the Assad regime, who was part of the Shiite they were Alawites, not Shiites, but they were part of that same kind of Iranian-led axis of resistance, they called it. And so it's made a big difference there, and it also was Russia's only base in the Mediterranean. So now if they're withdrawing from there and withdrawing back to the Black Sea and back to Crimea and the eastern Black Sea, then that's a major withdrawal for them in a grand strategic, like in a geostrategic way. That's a big thing. But as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, that also means that all that equipment that was tied up in Syria is now free to be used. And there's aircraft, there's ships, there are troops, there's artillery, there's all the stuff that you need. Now, they had been using some of that already, but they had a need to keep their forces there as well to protect Assad. But now that Assad's gone, if they're withdrawing, it means they can move all that equipment, including, you have to talk about this sort of thing, you have to start thinking about people as being equipment. So soldiers are equipment. If we talk about they're moving equipment from Syria to Luhansk or Donetsk, the equipment includes people. So that's, remains to be seen what a difference that would make. But certainly it means that they've got more forces to deploy against Ukraine because they're not having to defend their positions in Syria. That's the effect on the Ukraine war. There's other effects on the rest of the region that we might do another program on.
Dr. Ken Fraser, it's always fascinating to listen to you, and I learned so much, and I can't wait to have you back on the show. I think for now that was just really, really critical to get more insight into this terrible war, between Ukraine and Russia. And I look very much forward to have you back soon to discuss more.
Yes, I'll be happy to come back soon. But you can, when you're talking about these matters, you can get into a kind of frame of reference or a way of talking about it that is about. It seems like we're talking about chess pieces on a chessboard, but you're quite right. We should never forget that it's torn limbs and splattered brains and horrific injuries and the trauma and the damage and just the sheer horror of what gets done in these sorts of situations is really beyond most of us living in comfortable Western countries like the one I live in. Just really have no idea how horrific that kind of destruction is. Just imagine your whole city where you live being turned into dust in a matter of a few weeks or a year or two. It's really hard to imagine, but we should not forget, as you say, the horrendous suffering on a huge scale. It's very hard to grasp the scale.
Dr. Ken Fraser. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.